Welcome to Ryan. I'm your host, and thank you for tuning in. So, today on RCAM, we are going to be discussing the girl bosses again. So, we will be discussing Tomi Lahren's recent interview with Laura Ingraham. We will also be discussing my favorite Congresswoman, Nancy Mace. And we will be live reacting to a interview that Jordan Peterson did with Ultra Girl boss Megyn Kelly. She is like the final boss of conservative girl bosses. So we'll be diving into that and more. So if you like this content, please like, share, subscribe, click that notification bell to stay notified every time we go live. And we go live every Monday through Saturday at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you are not already, get on Rumble Premium. Go ahead and subscribe. Go ahead and support them. They are creating something that I think is awesome, that I think is just changing the game. They are the only truly free speech platform. So I can pretty much say whatever I want to say and not have to worry about getting censored or getting banned or getting flagged for copyright. I can freely speak my mind, and I am very grateful to the Rumble team because of that. So I highly encourage supporting them and highly encourage getting premium. Plus, you don't get any ads, so that's a perk. That's definitely a perk. So anyway, appreciate you guys. And without further ado, we're just gonna get into this. So Tomi Lahren is uh she's not one of my favorite conservatives, and she hasn't been for a long time. So she kind of made her headway into conservative politics when she came out pretty vocally in support of Trump, and she had some quick-witted, snappy videos that she used to do, and they were good. They were, they were entertaining. She's good at what she does. I'm not going to take that away from her. But then she did something that totally torched her credibility, in my opinion, as a conservative. And she took one of the most anti-conservative stances, which is she came out in support of abortion. She came out as pro-choice, and she took the lazy approach and basically said, now I'm personally against murdering unborn babies, but I support a woman's right to do so. And that, I think, was the beginning of her downfall, at least to me. She was, I believe, fired from, I think she was working for the Blaze at the time, and she was shortly let go after that. Big shocker there. And yeah, it just was not good. So we'll play a clip from that her interview on The View, and then we'll play a couple other clips featuring her. All right, let's play this.
You call yourself a conservative Republican and a constitutional conservative, but you also consider yourself pro-choice, which is interesting to me because 68% of conservative Republicans think that abortion should be illegal across the board.
No, I'm pro-choice, and here's why. I am a constitutional, someone that loves the Constitution. I am someone that's for limited government, and so I can't sit here and be a hypocrite.
Except that part where like all human beings are born with, the certain inalienable rights. except for that part.
And say I'm for limited government, but I think that the government should decide what women do with their bodies. I can sit here and say that as a Republican, and I can say, you know what, I'm for limited government. So stay out of my guns, and you can stay out of my body as well. So I think it's...
You need to go out and speak to women about that.
I do every day.
Republican women.
I do every day.
Okay.
And, I get a lot of attacks from conservative women as well.
Yeah.
I think it's
unusual.
Equal hate from all sides for me.
You don't have any...
That's unusual. That's unusual that conservatives would attack a quote-unquote conservative who supports murdering babies in the womb. One of the core principles of conservatism is guaranteeing human rights to our most vulnerable. And what is I don't know this woman's, I forget her name. She's shocked. What? No, you don't say. Shocking. But so this to me was a huge red flag on my end. I stopped paying attention to pretty much anything Tomi Lahren said after that. She outed herself as being basically, liberal. Just because you support the right to bear arms and some other conservative positions doesn't necessarily make you a conservative. If you are denying people their right to live, like I think a fundamental pillar of being conservative is guaranteeing people the right to be alive. If you reject that, it's very hard for me to take you seriously on anything after that. And then not only that, but then she's adopting leftist framework for her argument. She really said, like the government doesn't have a right to tell me what to do with my body. Tomi, we're not telling you what to do with your body. We don't care what you do with your body. Well, most conservatives don't. We're telling you what you can't do to another human's body. And it's just such a stupid talking point. It's stupid when leftists make it. It's even more dumb when conservatives do. Because it totally just undermines their conservatism. So that's one thing that kind of just sets the stage for the type of person that Tomi is. So it doesn't surprise me when she's outed as basically being a covert feminist. Here's another clip recently of a segment from Piers Morgan featuring I only know Andrew Wilson, Piers Morgan, and Tomi. I don't know these other two. But I think Andrew makes a pretty solid case in this solid debate against Tomi. So we'll talk about that a little bit.
Panel. Correct. So I'm really anxious to weigh in. Okay. So I think over the last probably 10 years, there has been what I call the pussification of men. It was everything should be about your emotions and your feelings, and men were emasculated, and this whole concept of toxic masculinity warped the minds of a lot of young men. And they felt masculine, they wanted to be masculine, but society was telling them they should be softer, that it was being toxically masculine if you wanted to play sports and chop wood and go to war. And so men were so emasculated and so beat down that then there was this revolution of what was actually toxic masculinity, the Tate brothers and others, which I feel as a female that doesn't represent true masculinity. That to me represents douchebaggery. And as a woman, I want a strong man who is the protector and a provider that will go to war if need be, that will protect me, protect my family, make money. I see that as being actually masculine. That's like the man that I grew up with, my dad. But what we're seeing now is these young men who look at Andrew Tate and the Tate brothers, and they see somebody who's just quite frankly a douchebag and disrespects women. And because they've been so emasculated, they're like, oh, great, that's a manly man. But that's not right either. So at some point, I think we'll go back to maybe meeting in the middle here. You can be a man who has feelings and emotions, but you can also go to war and protect and defend your family. I'm hoping we can get back there. But the two extremes right now, they're confusing men, and quite frankly, they're leaving women with few choices. And that's the real tragedy here.
You see, I completely agree with you, but Andrew, you were shaking your head quite vigorously. Why?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just more feminine or feminist nonsense, ultimately. And the covert feminism in society is big, especially on the conservative side. So here's what happens, right? Women need to have feminine virtues for men to be pursuing masculine virtues, for you to say things like, well, men, what I want is for men to protect me and I want men to make money. Well, that's great. What that ends up doing is it gives you a set of privilege in society. What do men get? What do men get for doing that for you? What are we getting from women for doing that? Are we getting chaste virgins on our wedding night? No, we're not getting chaste virgins on our wedding night. Are we getting women of great virtue? No, we're not getting women of great virtue. The idea of courtly love is supposed to be done for women of great virtue. Where are they? Well, they're nowhere. And so in modernity, in society, when female conservative influencers say this, it's actually a form of covert feminism. They're saying, I want privilege in society, right? But what is it women are giving to men to get it? What? What are they giving them?
He makes a good point. What are women doing? What are they doing? Now, I will concede that I don't think that men like Andrew Tate are the healthiest forms of masculinity, and I've said this before and I will say it again. I do not think that Andrew Tate is a good role model for what it means to be a man. I think the peak role model of what it means to be a masculine man is embodied in the life of Jesus Christ, and that should be who we should ultimately look to. I don't think we should be taking cues from a guy that is brazenly engaged in, like polygamous relationships. I don't support that. I'm not down with that. So, I don't think Andrew Tate is definitely the healthiest role model for masculinity, but Andrew Wilson makes a good point in the sense that what are women doing? What are they changing in their lives to, I guess, expect the privilege of getting a truly masculine man? Because I agree that men should be protectors and they should be providers, but they never get to the point where they stop and ask, well, what should women do? What is the role of a woman in society? What is she to bring to the table? And Andrew Wilson touched on this. He said, are they getting chaste virgins? Are they getting women of character? Is Tomi advocating for women to be virtuous, to be meek, to be humble, to have a servant heart, to yield to male headship? Is she advocating for women to prioritize their home? Certainly not. And she's certainly not leading by example either. We've already seen her her opinion on what we should do with babies in the womb, and it's not pretty. It's not pretty by any stretch of the imagination. So I do think Andrew Wilson makes a great point here. We don't have virtuous women, but then we have this expectation that men should without getting anything in return, just be protectors and providers. There has to be a balancing act. There has to be something too that they're working toward. So it's no wonder to me that men are demoralized. It's no wonder to me that men have largely given up on dating, because there aren't many women out there that pursue virtue. And then the ones that are claiming to be conservative love their careers more than the idea of having a family. I read a post recently about a guy who was talking about the prospect of, that he wants 5 kids, and he said that when he tells this to women, they kind of recoil at the notion of having 5 kids, like it's a bad thing. And I think most conservative women and even men find this off-putting, but it shouldn't be. It should be something that we aspire to. Big families used to be a beautiful thing, but now the bigger your family is, the more looks you get, the more people are like, oh, you're weird, like, or they think you're being abusive. They thought this guy was being abusive because he wanted 5 kids, which is it's just wild to me. There's one more clip I want to play of her recently being on Laura Ingraham's show, and then we will shift gears a little bit. All right, so this is from The Quartering. Tomi Lahren has 0 kids, and Laura Ingraham is unmarried. Here they say the problem with society is lazy men. They are both feminists in disguise.
Johnson has been talking about those maybe deadbeat folks that are on Medicaid, and maybe some of those folks are the stay-at-home sons. We don't know. But I'll tell you this, leave it to Gen Z to rebrand laziness and social awkwardness as something cutesy, like a stay-at-home son. They did much the same thing with quiet quitting, where you can go to work and do less, and if you call it quiet quitting, it's somehow better. But Laura, I got to tell you, this is also a big problem when it comes to, I think, declining birth rates, people not getting married and having children. That's a big problem. They blame it on women. Well, look at what young women have to choose from. The pickings are slim. Yes, we might have a feminism problem in America, but it's the feminization of men. There are a lot of young women out there that want to get married. They want to have kids. They want to have stable families. But there are a lot of young men out there who want to live in mama's basement and order DoorDash. And therein lies a big part of the problem. It's a major problem. And, Speaker Johnson has been talking.
All right. Gosh. Well, I agree with her that you shouldn't be a deadbeat son. I think men should be working hard, whether they are married or not. Like, your responsibility to yourself is to work hard, especially if you're conservative. You have 0 excuse, because if you're not married, well, you should be working unto God. You should be glorifying God through your work. So there's no excuse for not working hard. There just isn't. And this idea of quiet quitting is a joke. It is an excuse for laziness. So Tomi does get it right there. And Gen Z are masters at rebranding these types of things. What is they pretended that they discovered walking, silent walking. It's where you walk without any headphones on, and you just listen to nature. So they just discovered walking is what they did. And then what else? Oh, they recently discovered that you can do this radical thing called making coffee in your own home to save money. You don't have to go to Starbucks. What? It's so crazy. So I'm with Tomi there. Now, where she loses me is the declining birth rates, because most men want families. Most men want to get married and want to have children. Now, I'm not saying there aren't some that don't, but I think most men do. It's women that overwhelmingly don't want these things, and they would prefer to pursue their career And I will give them the benefit of the doubt that they have been exposed to severe propaganda most of their lives that have told them over and over and over and over again that they don't need a man, that their worth is found in their work, and that they should pursue their career at all cost. Another problem, though, is when women like Tomi talk about not being able to find good men. Well, I just talked about this the other day. Well, you're filtering most of the good men out because women are so, or some women are so superficial that you have to have all this crazy criteria for a woman to even consider dating you. Like if you're not above 6 foot, you're filtered out. And that's just height requirements. And they also have financial requirements and all these other requirements, while at the same time, they themselves not having really anything to bring to the table. They're not virgins. They don't know how to cook. They don't clean. They would prefer they would murder their future spouse's sons. They prefer to a career over family, and you wonder why men might not be interested in that. You wonder where the good men are. Well, they're out there. They just don't want women like you. So that's Tomi Lahren, man. This woman, I just, I don't like her. She's among the few conservative women that I just find obnoxious, and I don't, I don't enjoy her commentary. And she is a covert. I think she's not a covert. She's an overt feminist. She's adopted lots of feminist framework. And this is a real problem for conservatives because they keep propping up feminists or basically liberals. And this brings me to the Young Women's Leadership Conference. This is from JD Beach. The new Christian right. We need to return to true femininity. Conservative. Here are your right-wing branded girl boss feminists. So I would say not all of these women are, and some of them I just don't know. But let's go down the list. Alex Clark, she's okay. I like Alex. She is unmarried though, so that's one thing. She's in her 30s, not married, has, from what it seems like, focused on her career. I don't know who this woman is. Tulsi Gabbard is a new convert to conservatism. So she's not. She was running, by the way. Just to refresh your memory, as a a Democrat, and because she got scorned by the left, she came to the right. But I still think she is mostly, has at least libertarian views on most issues. So there's Tulsi Gabbard, Brett Cooper. She's one of the good ones. I like Brett. She's fine. Nothing bad to say about her. Allie Beth Stuckey's cool. Riley Gaines and Dana Loesch, I will lump them both together because they did something very similar, and they were featured in Calendargate. I don't know if you guys remember that, but they took scantily clad photos in a beer company's calendar to sell beer using half naked women, and they were a part of that. They supported that. They allowed their pictures to be taken. Now, I would say they were probably more modest than some of the girls in that calendar, but that certainly wasn't conservative. I will say that. Lila, she's a good one. I don't know. Most of these women, I just have no idea. Oh, we'll talk about Nala. Nala is a former porn star. She did OnlyFans, and she gave her life to Christ. I'm not super sold on it. I was at first, but I came around. But before we get to Nala, we're going to talk a little bit about Nancy Mace. She is the girl boss of girl bosses. So this is a post from Nancy Mace not that long ago. Time for LGBTs to divorce the T's. LGBs to divorce the T's. So she is totally cool with lesbians and gays and bis, just not the trans stuff. She's fine with that. And this is our conservative champion. Except it's all degenerate. You know, she there was a video that went viral of her arguing with a homosexual man. And then bragging and boasting about how she voted for gay marriage twice. And we're supposed to celebrate this. This is our role model for conservative women. Yeah, I'm not buying it. And, you know, so another, you know, fake conservative feminist in disguise. And then we have Nala. So I'm not going to doubt that Nala is conservative, okay? My problem, or even Christian, although I do find myself more suspicious of that. My problem with Nala is that she's a new convert and she doesn't really have any business being at these events. She doesn't. She needs to kind of sit back, learn, yield, and listen. Now, if she's going up there and giving her testimony, that's fine. But if she's, lecturing women on how to be leaders, no, I think you need to lead by example first and live a quiet life, learn to be a good wife, and not, profit off of selling courses to deliver men from pornography, which is a problem that she helped contribute to. And I'm not making that up. She has a website where she sells courses, her and her husband, to help men overcome porn addiction. And that's something that I think she should personally be giving away for free. I don't think she has any business doing that. So anyway, this is all to say that the state of conservatism is not good right now. And that will bring us to Jordan Peterson's conversation with Megyn Kelly, which we will get into. Now, I am no fan of Megyn Kelly. I have commented on Megyn Kelly several times. Megyn Kelly, at least for me, is most well known for talking about how some men like the fire and excitement of a working woman. Said no man ever. There is no man in all of existence who has ever stated that he wants the fire and excitement of a working woman. That man does not exist, but this is something that Megyn Kelly has explicitly said. And she's got into spats with Matt Walsh online, and now she's sitting down with Jordan Peterson. And she is going to be debating whether women can have it all. So let me just fix this screen real quick, and we will get into it, because I think it is a conversation that needs to be had. And I'm oh man, I'm genuinely curious. Now, I have not watched this, so I'll be live reacting to this. So just bear with me as I respond to this and what they're going on. So I will be jotting things down and taking notes as we go along. So let's play it.
Half of Western women, 30 and under, have no child. Half of them will never have a child, and 90% of them will regret it. This is a catastrophe.
Your life will be happier if you have a partner and children. That's just true. And people should be told that, and then they should be told the realities of fertility. But in my case, Jordan, from that day to this, I've always loved working. I love it. It's totally exciting and interesting and intellectually stimulating to me, and I cannot imagine not doing this.
We do potentially have a major societal issue in that men have their pathologies that are expressed socially, aggression, antisocial behavior, drug and alcohol abuse, but there's no reason to assume whatsoever that women wouldn't bring their own pathologies to the workplace.
I've seen women behaving terribly over the past 5 years in particular, and they're at the apex of the bad messaging. They're obsessed with abortion, which I just think speaks to a lot of things like the absence of religion in the public square. So I just think the whole system is set up to breed that kind of woman.
She ain't wrong about that. The whole system is set up to breed that type of women, which is exactly one of the problems that we are having, is that the system churns out women exactly like this. There is no emphasis placed on child rearing. Women, do you remember a single woman in high school who said to you that motherhood was a viable and beautiful option? Just an option. Or when you were in high school, was all the messaging about how being a mother is not a good thing, how being a mother is a stumbling block to your success? I would like to know, because I'm willing to bet that the messaging that you got in high school and for most of your life is that motherhood is a barrier to success. So it's no surprise when this machine churns out so many feminists and even conservative feminists, when this ideology has taken root even in the church. And then the result is that, women aren't prepared for motherhood. They want to start being mothers too late because they spent the first part of their life pursuing a career. And then by that time they have issues with fertility, which she briefly mentioned. So let's play this. That's loud.
It's become mandatory in our culture to assume that the feminine...
I do suspect this might get pulled from YouTube, by the way. They don't play well with reaction videos. So if it does get pulled from YouTube, you can follow me at RCAM on Rumble, or you can watch this on X at RCAM_media. So if it does get pulled, that's probably the case. It's probably going to get copyrighted.
This movement has elevated women to the status that they now enjoy. I'm not so sure about that. I think that technological transformation and plumbing has had a lot more to do with that than ideological movement, let's say, especially one based on resentment. But in any case, it is the case that women occupy a position in society that was unheard of 100 years ago. There's a downside to all of that. And the downside appears to be the mounting unhappiness among young women, the precipitous decline in birth rates, the collapse of marriage as a social institution, and a spate of childlessness among young women, as well as the feminization of our institutions in a manner that often borders on the pathological. I discussed these issues today with Megyn Kelly, a woman who's married, who has children, and who's had a stellar career. And we attempted to sort through these thorny issues and come to a conclusion about how men and women might conduct themselves in relationship to one another and what the consequences of that are for the way we think about ourselves and society. You've had a very successful career, and I'm kind of curious about how you've balanced your life and your work and how that's worked for you, and what advice you would give young women who are apparently struggling quite radically. Now, young men have their problems, and there's no doubt about that, but I think it's something in the neighborhood of 50 to 60% of liberal young women in particular between the ages of 18 and 34 who suffer from at least one diagnosable mental disorder, for example. And, when polls show pretty consistently that since the 1960s, the average self-reported happiness of young women in particular has declined, and quite precipitously. So let's start with that.
Well, I'm not surprised to hear those stats about liberal women in particular, because look, I see it with my own daughter who's 14. The schools today try to exploit young girls and young women's empathy to bend them to their democratic norms. They try to impose all of their left-wing viewpoints on these young girls by tapping into the empathy vein. If you don't support Black Lives Matter, you're racist. If you don't support trans girls, meaning boys, playing in girl sports, you're a bigot. They're bullied. Don't be a bully. Be a nice.
Yeah, they do exploit empathy. They use this and weaponize this against women and men. This is something that liberals are known to do, and they consider you a bad person if you don't adopt their framework, or if you're not more empathetic, and they will use this to try to make you feel bad and guilt you and gaslight you into going along and adopting their worldview. So I think Megyn, rightly identifies that schools exploit that with young girls.
Nice girl. That's how we've been raised for time immemorial, to be nice girls who get patted on the heads. And you're not a nice girl if you're a bully or a bigot or a racist. So I'm not surprised at all that girls who don't get inoculated against that.
Now, I don't think women have been taught to be nice girls. I don't think that. I think one of the messaging that we see commonly is that women are encouraged to be, bad girls, that's the sentiment that you see. Oh, she's bad, like you see that echoed in culture. So I don't necessarily agree with that, but I do agree that they are supposed to, and they are bullied into accepting, the framework that, they are racist or homophobic or a bigot if they have basic Christian principles.
That kind of thinking at home, who go into any normal school system, will be indoctrinated in that kind of thinking, and will wind up very unhappy, because her natural instincts will be to fight against things like watching a boy take all of her blue ribbons. But she's been told by all the people she respects, in the school setting at least, that she's a bad person if she objects to that. And I think that incongruous feeling leads to unhappiness. I think the reward system of K through 12 and college education right now is for people who play the victim. And so much the better if you could actually be a victim. That would be terrific. You will be celebrated. You will be the cool one. You'll get the snaps from your fellow classmates and your professors. Writing your college essay about what a happy childhood you had and your intact family that supported you and loved you along the way will not get you in anywhere. Maybe 3 universities in the United States.
Yeah, that is something that I do want to talk about, because I think this is a problem at large, is that we as a culture, as a society, glorify victimization to the point where almost everybody I knows, they're dealing with depression or anxiety or some sort of mental health issue, and that it is almost weird to be somebody that has it together for the most part. So when I hear people talking about, their depression or their anxiety, I feel weird. I feel almost alien, because I don't struggle with that. That is not something that I experience. I don't, and not to say that I never feel sad, okay? That's not what I'm saying. But I don't experience depression. This is not to say that I don't ever experience anxiety, but I think I experience anxiety in moments where you probably should experience anxiety. All right. When you're When I had to take my IT exams to get my certifications, and it was right before exam day, I was nervous. I had a little bit of anxiety. That's normal. You should. That's healthy, even. All right. If my 6-year-old is going a little too deep in the water, I get a little anxious. That's normal. That's good. That's healthy. All right. But this crippling anxiety, this crippling depression, it's something I don't relate to, but I feel weird. I feel like the weird one by being, oh well, no, I'm just happy. I'm in a good mood. I'm not depressed about life. I can't relate because I'm generally pretty happy about the state of affairs. Now, it doesn't mean that I think the world's all rainbows and unicorns. I have accepted the reality of the world. Okay, I accept it for what it is. But this isn't something that I've allowed to cripple me in the way that it has crippled a lot of people in my generation.
But writing about the destitution derby that you have suffered from 0 to 18 can open doors that would otherwise be closed to you, especially if you happen to be a white person, a girl or boy. So all of the incentives are set up in a very backward manner. And I think the other problem facing young liberal women is young liberal men who, by and large, are being turned into these, it's derogatorily referred to as soy boys, but I get it. Like, they're taking the masculinity out of our young men and then telling them that's the only way that they're going to be accepted. And especially young liberal men are buying that and walking around in Birkenstocks with their Starbucks, being quick to cry at any emotional wound. And
yeah, she's hitting on something. I think that is true. Yeah, there are a lot of young liberal men who have adopted this feminist framework because they think it's the right thing to do, and they reject masculinity in and of itself and have adopted femininity. I debated this kid Oliver. I don't know if any of you guys have watched Andrew Wilson's recent debate with Oliver on the Whatever podcast, but I debated Oliver back, I think it was like March, on an episode of Jubilee, and we discussed feminism and toxic masculinity, and this idea if misandry is more of a problem than misogyny. And I was arguing from the position that it was. Anyway, I think he is like the embodiment of what it means to be like a liberal soy boy male. He is the embodiment of that, to the point where this kid, man, oh man, Jesus, he basically said he would be okay, or he would prefer his whatever girl he's dating to have experienced sleeping with other men before him, so that she has a frame of reference. And it was just so it was just so off-putting and weird. Like, no sane man would want that. No sane man would accept that. It's just bizarre and weird.
And crying's not, that's fine. You can cry as a man, but most women would like somebody who doesn't do it all the time in response to all emotional upset. They prefer the hunter-gatherer types.
And she's also right about this crying thing. Like, yeah, women don't respect you as a man if you're crying. They find it pathetic and off-putting. They do. No, even if they say that they don't, they do. And the second that you cry in front of a woman, you are sending the message that you are not emotionally stable, that you are not somebody that they can depend on during times of turmoil. And that's actually something that I think Jordan Peterson has talked about before. He talked about this idea of being the type of person that you can turn to during a time of crisis. And this is what men should aspire to be. That's the type of man that I aspire to be. Yeah, I'm not going to say I never cry, but I certainly do not cry in front of my family. I won't do that. And, I certainly want to be the type of person that if crisis hits my family, that they look to me as their rock, as the one who is going to guide them, help guide them through this storm. And ultimately, I'll be taking my cues from Jesus. So there are appropriate times and places when a man should cry. Yeah, and I think Jesus was the perfect embodiment of this. When Jesus uh, was bearing witness basically to the death of his friend Lazarus, and he's seeing the weight sin had and the weight death had on the people that he loved. It's the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. He wept. That was an appropriate time to cry. Somebody died. Another time he cried when he was off alone in the Garden of Gethsemane, before, as he is praying to God and seeking God as to what to do about this burden that he's feeling to carry the cross. He cried blood, but he did that off and alone and away from people. So I think Jesus was demonstrating for us moments where it is appropriate to cry. But this is not something we as men do, one, in front of women, unless it's something severe like death, and constantly. Like, there has to be an appropriate reason for it. And because your tummy hurts and life is hard is not one of them.
And so these young women I talk to on college campuses are looking around for a man who will protect her, who will help lead, who is not afraid to enter hand-to-hand combat if necessary, or just rhetorical combat if necessary, and who, while he treats her as an equal, will put his coat over her shoulders if it's a cool night out, will absolutely protect her if somebody messes with her on the street, will, like my husband does with me, gently move me to the side that's not facing the traffic along the road. Just those small little things that a man does for a woman, and women have a different list that they do for their men if they're in a kind and loving relationship. And instead, what they're getting is somebody who wants to braid each other's hair, which would depress you and make you question the whole experience.
Yeah, well, it's not.
Before Jordan talks, I do think, women do want men to be a protector, and I think men should aspire to be protectors. But I also think women need to hold up their part of the deal, as I had covered earlier in Andrew Wilson's debate with Tomi Lahren. All right, like yes, it's fine to have these expectations, but you also need to be holding yourself to the same standard. And I think chivalry is a beautiful thing. Yeah, men should take off their coat for their spouse. About 2 weeks ago, it was raining heavily outside, and my wife comes home late, and I stay up late, by the way, every night for my wife. I could go to sleep, but I don't want my wife walking in at night. She works in the evening. She works at a restaurant. I wait up for her, and I get up really early in the morning. All right, I get up at 4:50 in the morning. So I wait up for my wife, but the other day it was raining. I went outside with an umbrella, opened my wife's door, held the umbrella over, walked her to the door, because that's the right thing to do as a man. But my wife, she doesn't renege on her responsibilities. She knows her role in our household. She cooks, she cleans, she does the laundry, she takes care of the kids, she homeschools. She values and prioritizes her business in the home. And the little bit of time that she does work, because I don't want people to think that I don't think women should work. I think it's fine that women work as long as that's not their priority, as long as they don't love their job more than their family, as long as their job is only a means of provision for their family. This is what we learn about the Proverbs 31 woman. Everything that she's doing, her considering the field and buying it, and her selling linen and stuff in the marketplace, she's doing that for the benefit of her family. And that's where modern women get it twisted. They do it for the esteem. And that's what it sounds like for Megyn, is that she chose her career for her love for it and the esteem of it, while she had nannies and other people helping raise her kids, which is something that most women will not experience.
Surprising, I suppose, that boys are turning in that direction. You know, I met a young man in a restaurant a while back. He wasn't looking too bad when he approached me. He was a waiter, and he said that he had started listening to first Ben Shapiro and then me 6 years ago, something like that, and that prior to that, it was his proclivity and his friends to compete with one another with regard to their victim status, let's say, and to present themselves as radically feminized to the young women that, in principle, they were with. He said that was necessary with the girl he had dated at one point because she was very radically liberal, and that was a job requirement, you might say. And he shook all that off and told me and my wife, who was sitting with me, that he was much happier for it. But it doesn't really surprise me, Megyn, because boys are not well served in the education system at all, right? Their play preferences. I was just reviewing some stats on ADHD over medication among young boys with one of my producers. And what the original hypothesis, such as it was with regards to hypothetically hyperactive boys, was that stimulants, which is what Ritalin is, have a paradoxical effect on hyperactive young boys, calming them down. And that's complete bloody biochemical nonsense, and it's a lie psychologically. What stimulants do is focus people intently on whatever they happen to be focused on. And they have exactly the same effect on ordinary boys as they do on hyperactive boys, not least because 90% or 95% of hyperactive boys are actually normal. Stimulants suppress play behavior in animals. So he gives stimulants to young juvenile rats, for example, who are very playful. Then they stop playing. And that's exactly why they're administered to young boys in schools. And so their play proclivity is punished quite severely. Any attempt they make to be competitive in a world of cooperative games, and there's really no such thing as a cooperative game, although all games that are rule governed are cooperative. Any sign of ambition they have is pilloried. They're associated constantly with the destructive patriarchy and presented to the world as enemies of the planet. And so it's not surprising that they tilt in a, let's say, feminized direction, especially to appease the angrier women. And there's a deeper problem.
He is so on point about that. So in my debate on Jubilee, one of the things that I had brought up to this kid Oliver that I was debating. Good God, don't clip that. Don't take that as a concept. Good Lord. Debating was this idea that young boys are overly medicated and they go to school and they are slapped with these ADHD drugs because who they inherently are is seen as a problem. When young boys are demonstrating healthy masculinity, where they have this energy that they need to expel, and it's causing disruptions in the classroom, the solution is not to restructure the classroom to accommodate these young boys. The solution is to slap these young boys with the ADHD medication to get them to comply. And Jordan Peterson literally just confirmed that idea, that these drugs have the same effect, not just on ADHD boys, but ordinary boys. And it suppresses their desire to play and makes them more compliant and less competitive. And their ambition is ultimately stifled. So what it essentially does is it turns young boys into women. It makes them more feminine. It deprives them of who they inherently are, to get them to be a part of this system that isn't built for them. It isn't designed for them. And then we wonder why young men are becoming more liberal, why young men are less masculine, why we see surges of men who are depressed and violent and addicted to pornography and drugs and everything under the sun. Well, it's because the core of who they are at a young age is being stifled with drugs to rob them of their masculinity. And that is sad. Like, I could not imagine being a young boy growing up today, especially if you're part of the public school system and that you have no outlet to be competitive. And that play, by the way, is one of these things that helps us learn and figure out the world around us. So if boys don't have that ability to demonstrate play, and that's being stifled, well, maybe it comes out in destructive ways that we are seeing happen in our culture today.
Problem here that I'd like your thoughts on. You know, the most woke disciplines in the universities, and that's really saying something, are the female-dominated. The more female-dominated they are, there's another contributing factor, right? So the less cognitive power the discipline requires, the more woke it tends to be. So physics is about the least woke discipline, whereas social work, well, the less said about social work, the better. But so we have an issue here too, because I have a suspicion, you tell me what you think about this, because I'm very curious, that the default female ethos, let's say, is nurture. This isn't really a radical idea, I don't think, is nurturer to infant. And in the absence of managerial training, let's say, or rigorous mentoring in the operation of large-scale organizations, every situation turns into an infantilized family. I mean, and it's become absolutely preposterous in universities. I mean, the faculty, to their own discredit, have been infantilized by the administrators. You know, we have never seen a large-scale incursion of women into large organizations prior to the last 40 years. That's never happened in human history. And we have no idea what the social psychopathology that would be associated with that, as well as the positive benefits. We have no idea what the social psychopathology might be. But the infantilization of everyone and everything might well be it. And so I'm curious about what you think about that. You know, there is data, for example, that women prefer male supervisors. So that's one, you know, it's not overwhelming. It's not overwhelming data, but it's suggestive. And obviously that doesn't mean there are no good female managers. We're talking about broad trends here, but we do potentially have a major societal issue in that men have their pathologies that are expressed socially: aggression, antisocial behavior, drug and alcohol abuse, a tilt towards a kind of self-serving narcissism in some cases, but there's no reason to assume whatsoever that women wouldn't bring their own pathologies to the workplace. And it is the female-dominated institutions that seem to be the most woke.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. Yeah, you're probably not seeing as many woke individuals in physics, all right? Because it is intellectually demanding. And social work, it just isn't. And I know this because I did a little bit of social work. I didn't have a degree for it, but I'm like, oh yeah, this is easy. Yeah. This is, doing basically the role of a case manager without having the official title. I did that without a college degree. Really no knowledge. I just kind of learned on the job because it's easy. It's just interacting with people, understanding people, having social skills, which is maybe for Gen Z a little bit more difficult, but me, I was fine with it. I have great social skills. I'm a pretty social person. I don't know if you could tell. but not a difficult thing. And wokeness was prevailing in this field, by the way. I felt like the only conservative working in supported housing. Overwhelmingly, it was female dominated, so I was one of the few men in there, and overwhelmingly, the women, at least in the beginning, were woke and supported wokeness. I remember getting lectured by one woman about not using a client's preferred pronouns, which I refused to do. I was not playing those stupid games. I just wasn't having it. So yeah, I do think that's interesting.
I mean, and that's how the 18 to 34-year-olds vote as well, right? They're radically out of phase with the entire rest of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think about that? And how would you reflect on that, like in your personal experience with the organizations that you've worked with and the managerial situations that you've been in?
It makes perfect sense to me. I accept that as a likely cause of the problem that we're seeing, and probably the more than likely culprit of it. I see exactly what you're saying. And it's, I guess with today's generation, I ask, it's like a chicken egg. Like these woke institutions are trying to exploit girls' natural empathy, as I said. But those women at some point were the first ones in to a system that hadn't been exploiting their empathy. And they ran wild with it, clearly, because we're now at the place we are. And I see it being done. We just played videotape on the show today from peak BLM, right after George Floyd.
Oh, yeah.
The riots everywhere. And one of those infamous videos where BLM members got up in the face of, it happened to be a woman of color. She looked Latina to me, sitting there trying to eat her lunch at an...
Can we just stop playing these dumb games and abandon the people of color thing? Like, oh, it's okay. You can say black. You can say Spanish. Latina, whatever. We don't have to do this because that's still part of adopting the woke framework. And I myself have been guilty of doing it, but I'm tired of it. No more.
An outdoor cafe, and the BLM crowd was moving in on her, standing over her, screaming in her face, trying to get her fist up to say Black Lives Matter. And it was all white women. And I remember this from when I lived on the Upper West Side, which included 2020 during the George Floyd-a-palooza.
You want to know something funny? So when this was happening with George Floyd and everybody was changing their profile pictures to blackout squares and all this stuff, I was the only one that just wouldn't do it. I had friends, shaming me, for, my takes on Black Lives Matter when it was happening. And now I feel completely vindicated, by the way, because we were 100% right about Black Lives Matter being a scam organization with hiding under the guise of, justice for George Floyd. It was a Trojan horse for Marxism. And they were aiming to destroy the nuclear family. They admitted to that, and many of us, rightly identified it at the time, were demonized because of it by white women.
And it was all white women who tended to have some money in their Lululemon out there at these BLM protests. It's like, okay, these women would never want that crowd coming back to their apartment building with them at the end of the day. But they want to be out there on the streets and pretend that they're one of them, that they understand the experience that, your average inner city person of color has had. It's a lie. So I accept, because I've seen women behaving terribly over the past 5 years in particular, and they're at the apex of the bad messaging, and they're the last to come along on the Trump train, which is also disturbing. Those same stats I've seen from that you're citing with the young women in particular. They're obsessed with abortion, which I just think speaks to a lot of things, like the absence of religion in the public square. No one's even telling them the other side or the other options. We had laws at one point where you'd have to show women the picture of the fetus before they could abort it, and those got struck down. It was like, no, you can't even show her what she's doing. So I just think the whole system.
That's changing, by the way. There are some organizations that are going around and they are showing women, giving women free sonograms to show them the baby growing inside their womb, and it is overwhelmingly effective in getting women to change their minds. So that's cool.
is set up to breed that kind of woman. Like, you'd almost think that it's the kind of woman that society wants because they're so prevalent.
Welcome to this episode of Parenting. They don't learn how that develop, particularly in that develop. Well, the question is, did we tilt in that direction with? There's certainly a strain of feminism that developed, particularly in the 1960s, although it was there long before that, that really did, in some ways, aim at that kind of women. And let me ask you something as well that's deeper. I've studied malevolence as deeply as I can for a very long time, and the philosophical representations of malevolence and the theological representations of malevolence. And the deepest representation is Luciferian, and that trope underlies, like, the evil scientist in popular entertainment, the idea of the intellect gone mad, the intellect that worships itself, that then usurps and attempts to put itself in the highest place. And so there's an idea that, this is Milton's idea, that Lucifer, who's the spirit of the unbridled intellect, the light bringer, is the spirit that was most finely made that went most dreadfully wrong. And so the psychological idea there is that there isn't anything more remarkable about human beings than their cognitive ability, but if it becomes master instead of serving something higher, then look the hell out. Now, there's an echo of that that's very, very deep with regards to...
I think there's some truth to that, because that's where pride comes in. Pride seeps in and starts to corrupt man. And when they are not yielding to something higher, a higher authority to themselves, then they in themselves become their own God. And in the beginning, when Eve is ultimately deceived from eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it is basically Lucifer, Satan, the devil, encouraging her to seek her own will above God's, to put her will, to serve herself above God and not be subservient to God, or even yielding to the husband who is with her in the garden. And Aleister Crowley, the founder of the Satanic Bible, adopts this ideology, the satanic ideology, that is rooted and grounded in do with that what thy will. Do what you will. Do what you want. Do what you desire. Do not submit. Do not serve to anything higher than your own self. And that is demonic and malevolent, evil.
The maternal instinct. And I think this is what's played out in the Genesis story of the consort between Eve and the serpent. What seems to me to happen is that...
Guys, I feel a little bit more intellectual than I actually am. That I picked up on that.
Eve clutches the poisonous serpent to her breast. And so that's an overextension of that empathy that you described, which is the core element, let's say, of the maternal instinct, and really the instinct that the species itself depends on, right? Human beings have the longest dependency period of any creature by a lot, and human infants are markedly helpless. And so that self-sacrificing compassion that's at the core of the maternal instinct is absolutely vital. But as Freud pointed out, if that goes wrong within families and overextends its domain, so that, for example, that infant-mother bond isn't attenuated as the child develops, then there's nothing that's more devouring than the mother. That's
one of the, I would say, one of the ugliest things that a woman can do is she deviates from that natural maternal instinct, and she gravitates toward something else. There's nothing more off-putting than seeing a woman that doesn't value being a nurturer for her children. one of a memory that stands out in my mind is when I was working in supported housing, I do home visits, and I remember as I was getting shown the ropes, getting brought to this one apartment, and uh this woman was living in this apartment. She had this beautiful little kid, but the kid was in like ratty, clothes, and the kid is trying to get the mom's attention, doing everything possible, dancing, twirling, trying to get the mom's attention. She's just cold, inattentive. She totally did not have that maternal instinct, and it was off-putting because I'm like, your little girl is right there. Just look at her. She just wants your attention. Now, my wife is a master at this, and it's one of the most beautiful things about her is that she has this knowing about our two girls that I don't have. She picks up on things that I wouldn't even notice. She has concerns about the kids that aren't even a thought in my mind. And that is one of the beautiful things about her. But when women deviate from this, it's deeply ugly and deeply tragic too, because it results in all kinds of evil against children. I mean, this is how women ultimately take the lives of their unborn babies, is that there's this deviation from the natural maternal instinct that they should have.
Story of Hansel and Gretel, right? They go out into the forest, chase their.
I just want to stop and say real quick, we have like 10 total, people watching this live right now, which is pretty cool. More than I'm accustomed to, and most of you guys are on YouTube. So I appreciate you guys, and thank you for watching.
They're not chased there in part by the fracturing of their family. And they find a gingerbread house, which is a little bit too good to be true, right? It's not only a house, but it's made out of candy. And so maybe you might suspect that the jig is up when something's painted that beautifully on the outside. I'm oh so compassionate and embracing. And of course, inside there's a witch whose goal is to fatten up the children and to make them helpless so that she can eat them. And so fairy tales are pretty vicious in that sort of representation, but that's also a portrayal of how all devouring the maternal embrace can be if it overextends its domain.
Yeah.
Now, it's not like men get off easy in that Genesis story, by the way, when Eve decides she's going to put herself at the center of the moral universe, because that's what she does. She's tempted to become like a god because that's the temptation, and she clutches the serpent to her breast. Adam doesn't object, and he goes along for the ride. And
that is one of the failures of man, by the way. When men renege on their responsibility as men, the consequences are disastrous. And because a man wasn't willing to assert his authority as a man and as a headship in that situation, well, it basically doomed humanity. So when a man isn't in his masculine role, fulfilling his duty as a man, being that protector, and standing up for what is right, standing up for what God had said, because God originally gave the command to Adam, all right, and then it's he was entrusted with this information and to share that with his wife, and there was an aspect in that where he failed, and the results were disastrous, and the consequences we are still feeling today.
Then later in the story, when God wants to walk with Adam so that they're working together, let's say, Adam is hiding behind a bush because he's realized that he's naked. And so the woman and the serpent have made him self-conscious, and now he doesn't have the courage to walk with God. And when God asks him why, he blames the woman, and he blames God for making her. And so I don't want to lay this all at the feet of women, because what I saw in the universities, for example, is that let's put it this way, that when the maternal instinct went astray, partly because it didn't have any valid target, the men just backed off and didn't oppose it. And so, they're complicit in this disintegration. But we do have a problem on our hands that's not trivial. And we also see this reflected in a growing political divide between young men in particular and young women all across the world, right? Young men are becoming more conservative.
Yeah, I know. It's
young
wonderful.
young women are becoming more liberal. And they're also not finding each other very effectively. The political, who would have guessed that, so we got two problems. Men and women both have the vote. Now, does that mean they're political enemies? Because that's certainly one of the things that appears to be happening. And then we have the mass migration of women into workforces of a size where empathy cannot be the regulating principle. I'll give you one more example, and then I'll turn it over for your comments. If empathy was the appropriate ethos for operation in a corporation, let's say, beyond the size of the family, then the personality trait agreeableness, which is the index of compassion and empathy, would positively predict workplace performance, particularly among managers. But it isn't agreeableness that predicts, it's conscientiousness, which is a cold virtue that typifies conservatives more than liberals. Big organizations run on raw cognitive power and conscientiousness. They don't run on empathy. Little bitty families run on empathy, especially when there are infants, but that doesn't scale. And I actually think that's why the personality trait conscientiousness, which is diligence, orderliness, industriousness, is associated often with patriotism and more conservative values. I think that's why it evolved, because empathy does not scale, because everyone isn't a big, happy family. And once you exceed kin group size in your organization, you have to turn to a different ethos. And that, I think that's particularly problematic for unconscientious women who self-aggrandize on the basis of their compassion.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, and I agree with a lot of it.
Yeah, something I wanted to touch on before we hear Megyn's responses. He talked about this idea of basically not letting men off the hook, and that men have, responsibility to bear. And I totally agree with that. One of the things that I remember distinctly when I was in the university, I went to a Christian school, and missions was a big part of what we did. We went on mission trips, and we did local outreach. And the people signing up for missions, though, were overwhelmingly women. Overwhelmingly. There were lots of men on campus, but it was predominantly women that were the one that were filling up the slots in these outreaches and missions trips. So when there is a lack of male leadership, well, women will take on that role. They shouldn't have to. They shouldn't be in situations where they have to do it. Like a lot of people will cite Deborah as an example in the Bible of, women in leadership, but she was in leadership only because no man was willing to step up to the plate. But that's not the way that it ought to be. Yeah, when men are behaving cowardly and are not walking in the authority that God has given them, well, God still has an agenda he has to accomplish, whether you're on board with it or not. And it is our responsibility to take on these roles of leadership and not relegate them to women, and to have them put that responsibility on their shoulders.
I keep thinking about the fact that, look, I'm a Gen Xer, and I was raised by a boomer, right, who was part of that first wave of feminism, who, they were told you can have it all at the same time, and you're kind of a failure if you don't have it all at the same time. And that generation of mothers did as told and left their kids alone for a large portion of their childhoods. And that wasn't a bad thing. and I have a great relationship with my mom. I'm not saying I'm glad she wasn't around that much, but it led to self-sufficiency and independence and absolutely no overbearing motherhood. That wasn't a thing in the 1970s or the 1980s. We were so neglected. We were called latchkey kids, where you had a key around your neck to let yourself back in after you walked home from school, and you didn't really know when your parents were going to come home. There were rules like, be home when it gets dark. Your parents had no idea where you were and really didn't care. Those were good things. Those were, building the ties for appropriate separation at the earliest possible age. Love always remains, caring and all that stays, but not overbearing motherhood or fatherhood for that matter. And that generation, so that's me now, and maybe my brother and sister, who are older. And I think we'll raise the solution to the problem that came just a little bit after we came. Because I think what started to happen was those women got into the...
I don't know. So I agree there has to be independence. All right, we have to foster independence in our kids, but I don't think leaving kids home all day long with no direction or no moral guidance was necessarily a net positive on society. I think that's how we got the culture that we're in, is that mom was off at work, dad was off at work, or dad was just not around. And it was just mom raising the kid and the kid being left alone. And the only guidance and direction that he was getting was coming from women. And then when he would go to school, guess who's giving him the guidance and direction? Women. And that's how men of I think weak character were built. Yeah, maybe independent, some of them, but also I think effeminate. Maybe this is more like millennials than Gen Z, but I mean, my childhood was not all that different. Me and my brothers had a lot of freedom and ability, and we were out until it got dark at night and all of that, and we fostered independence, but we also lacked moral guidance. Not to say that my mom didn't do the best that she could when she was around, or when I went to see my dad on weekends, they did, but for the most part, we were going at it alone because they had to work, and I don't know if that was necessarily a good thing.
The workforce, and they were doing it all, and they would commit to work because there was an understanding that they would not blow it for the next generation of women. They'd been given the keys to the kingdom. Now you come in and you do well at these jobs, and you don't talk about your kids, and you don't leave to go home early, and you don't insist on flexible work schedules. So the women did it, and they raised tough Gen X kids who were fine. But as they started to get more rights at the office, and it sounds great on paper, okay, flex time, and I only have to work part-time, and I have to leave early for this thing and the other thing and so on. And the workplace started to bend more to supporting what mothers needed in their motherly roles. The mothers were home more, and I think started to overcorrect, started to see like go from the latchkey kid to the, the helicopter parent, right? Where I'm never leaving you alone. I'm gonna somehow overcompensate and be the parent that I didn't have, or that the generation before me didn't have. And slowly we started to migrate to parents who never leave their children alone, mothers and fathers for that matter, but especially mothers. And that leads to helplessness, and it leads to leaning into victimization and finding.
I'm not, as a millennial, that was not my experience, and that was not the experience of any of my friends, all right? We did not have, there were no overbearing mothers in the home, all right? Just now, finally, the tides are turning where women are starting to prioritize the affairs of their home again. They're starting to go trad now. But this is a relatively new development. So we actually don't really know how those kids are going to be raised. Or maybe we do know, because we have like most of human history to look to see how kids turned out with having mothers in the home. And I like how she assumes that she makes it seem like this is all mothers, that they're not going to give their kids any degree of freedom. And I don't think that's true. I just don't.
finding the newest disorder and overplaying any injury, because you can get attention that way, especially when you have a mother whose competition you can potentially beat by overacting your injury or your upset, etc. Like if you're in competition with a job and she's got to go to the job and you know that, you don't do anything as the child. You understand that's the deal. But if there's a split between her attentions and you've got to play for it, I think you lean into more upset, more victimhood, more things that would get a mother's attention naturally. Like I have a disorder. I'm not well. I need extra help.
Yeah, well, that'll get her attention if she doesn't have anything better to do, and it has no sense, right? But that is another example of that exaggeration of compassion to the point that it becomes toxic, and the fact that it's necessary to human beings, especially in the early years, like vital, also means that it's a very difficult force to regulate. I mean, the general rule for caretaking, and this goes for the elderly as well, pretty much anybody you're actually taking care of, is don't do anything for anyone that they can do for themselves, right? Because you're actually stealing from them, not helping them. You know, I mean, certainly one of the rules for psychotherapy, insofar as there are actual rules for that enterprise, which has probably become now more destructive than useful, is that people have to make their own way, right? You listen and you help people strategize and you ask them questions, but you don't provide them with the direction for their life because that's their enterprise.
And you want to know something too? When I was about 16 years old, I started trying to build a stronger relationship with my dad. And my mom, my mom did a lot of stuff for me, right? So she just did. And as the result was, though, that I didn't know how to do a lot of stuff independently. And when I went to live with my dad, I remember it. This is one of those things that changed me as a man. And it might seem small, but it was pretty significant. I didn't know how to do like the paperwork at the DMV. My mom just handled that stuff, and I didn't think about it. Well, I had to get a car registered, and I go to my dad. I'm like, "Hey, Dad, when are you taking me to the DMV so we can go get the car registered?" He's like, "Oh, I'm not. You can take my car, whatever, and here's where it is. Good luck." And I was like, "Okay," and I was nervous. I was anxious at the time, but that fostered independence in me that I desperately needed, and it started to teach me that I need to do things for myself. And that happened from having my father's presence in my life, and I thought that was that just made me think of that moment. And I thought, yeah, there's something to that. Don't do anything for anybody that they can do for themselves. Yeah, and I think that's generally a good principle to live by.
And that requires it requires a hard bound on compassion, that's for sure, because you don't want to get in there and interfere. Can I ask you a little bit about the way that you constructed your own family and career pathway? Because I've been working with my wife, trying to sketch out, she does a podcast on issues related to femininity. And we've been trying to sketch out, at least hypothetically, something like a appropriate timeline for young women, because they have no real guidance in that. And so here's a stat for you. We hit this milestone last year. Half of Western women 30 and under have no child. So it's a little more than half now. So we hit more than half. Half of them will never have a child. And 90% of them will regret it. Mm-hmm. That means we're setting up. This is a catastrophe. This is a catastrophe if it's true. And the data are pretty clear, I believe. This means we're setting up 1 woman in 4 for isolation. Right? And that gets increasingly brutal as you get older. And I also think we're setting up that 25% of women to be preyed upon in a manner like nothing we've ever seen when they enter their later years, because they'll have no one to keep an eye out for them, especially during times of vulnerability. This is not going to be good. So let me sketch out an idea for you.
That's crazy. Half of women under 30 don't have a child. That is insane. And I suspect it's not because there's a lack of men who are willing to be fathers. All right? I suspect it's because they bought that bitter pill that they could have it all, as we will see Megyn Kelly argue later, that they could have it all, and they sacrificed their child rearing years on the altar of their career. And it's going to cost them everything. 90% will regret that decision. That is insane. And you know, it's so funny to me too, because there are girls that I knew in high school, rabid feminists, that had said things along the lines that they'll never have children. And lo and behold, some of them did, and I'm happy for them, generally. But they were so naive, and they were so adamant then that they wouldn't have kids, only to have their 30s, barreling toward them, that they ultimately changed their mind. But unfortunately, there will be a lot of women that don't ever come to their senses until it's too late. And then what?
In terms of a timeline, and tell me what you think about that. I mean,
Okay.
1 couple in 3 have fertility problems by the age of 30. And that's defined as not being able to conceive within a year of trying.
Right.
And so it seems pretty obvious. All assistive reproductive technology notwithstanding, which is very expensive and very unreliable and certainly not something to be depended on except in cases of absolute necessity. Having your children before you're 30.
Now, this is something I actually disagree with Peterson on. I don't think we should be depending on reproductive technology at all, because this only feeds women the lie that they can have it all, that they can put off having children until later in life. And it's just nonsense. You can't. You know, I remember reading this article about this woman who postponed having a baby so that she could pursue her career, and she had her eggs frozen, and when it came time for her to finally have kids, a lot of the eggs failed and they were no good, and one of them didn't implant, and her prospects of having a child went out the window. And she's on record saying she wailed and cried and wept bitterly because she wasn't able to have a child. She could not have it all. She could not come back for it, and it cost her her child rearing years. So maybe we shouldn't even propose IVF or surrogacy or any of these things as an option, because if it's an option, then women will naturally decide to lean on that option. But it's not just an option, it's encouraged. That there's actually people trying to pass legislation so that it's covered on the taxpayer expense. So it's something that should be discouraged, and not just because of the effects that it has on women, but also children. Like, we still don't know what impacts, or the repercussions of impacts that children being raised by like homosexuals are going to have. And Jordan Peterson, love the man. I appreciate his work, but he did this interview with Dave Rubin, who's a homosexual man, and he wanted children, and he did IVF, and he also did surrogacy. So he got eggs from him, and his quote unquote husband got eggs from 2 different women, and they both wanted boys. So they had both these eggs implanted into 2 different women, and now you have kids that are being raised by homosexual men who have 2 different mothers. And it's just this weird situation that we've never really seen before. We don't know the long-term implications of that and the identity crisis that it is going to cause on these kids, which is something that, at least up until this point, he hasn't touched on.
Is a wise move if you want to ensure that it's going to happen. And so then the question is order. You know, we're best served probably as human beings to have our children in our 20s and probably our early 20s. And of course, that's going to be more demanding for women, more demanding and more of an opportunity, I would say, because each child really requires something approximating 3 years of pretty dedicated care. You know, the data seem to show that if your child is 3 and reasonably social, then social education, daycare, can work. Before that, especially with transformation of caregivers, it doesn't look like it's a very good idea. So you need 3 years per child. And maybe you want 2 children or 3 children. And so that's something like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years that you have to devote to it. Now, women live about 6 or 7 years longer than men. So that's kind of an interesting little twist on the whole situation.
It's almost like God knows what he's doing. It's almost like God knows what he's doing, and he designed women to have children because he understands that raising children will take a degree of their time away from them. And to say that's a bad thing, but it is almost like he knows what they're doing. And I also agree with Jordan that having kids in your early 20s is probably the best situation. You know, me and my wife both talk about how we wish we started earlier. Now, we didn't start super late having kids. I believe, you know, she was 25 when we I was 20. Yeah, she was 25 when she got pregnant with our first daughter. So, you know, still, you know, our first 2 daughters, she was below 30, you know, and we had energy and youth for them. But, you know, I do understand that the older we get, the less energy that both of us will have, and we want to be in our prime for our kids, you know, and that was in our early 20s. And that you know, that window closed. And honestly, if we had our kids in our early 20s, you know, most of the most difficult parts about having kids would have been passed by now. So it's like that those first 3 years are challenging. You know, we have a 2-year-old right now. She's a firecracker, man. She's difficult, and that would have been over by now, you know.
And if you started your career at 30, you could have 40 years of career, which is a lot. And that way, I would say, in some ways, you get to have your cake and eat it too. Although,
yeah, I think we do have it backwards. I could agree with that. You know, I do think we have it backwards. I also, and I don't know if he's going to touch on this, but I also think one of the things that we could do so that women can have it all and men can have it all and your children can have it all is encourage more family-run businesses. You know, you all working together in the same business. I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think that's how it was for a lot of human civilization is, you know, you had these situations where people were working together on farms together as a family, and they were, you know, with each other constantly, and it built strong familial bonds, you know, and it gave them a sense of self-sufficiency independent from the government. And they had to rely and depend on each other, as I think it ought to be. And I've said this to my wife before, I would rather work 60 hours a week with my family than 40 hours a week away from my family, which is what I currently do right now. I work 40 hours a week away from my family. You know, I drive 45 minutes to get to work. I would much rather, you know, do something like this full time where I'm working full time to, you know, in my home with my family. Just give me 1 second. I'll be right back. I gotta go handle my responsibilities as a husband real quick and help my wife kill a bug. So just give me 1 minute. I'll be right back. I'm just gonna pause the stream. All right, sorry about
Though
that.
perhaps not at the same time,
I got
which we
it,
had
by the
talked
way.
about early. But there are no real guidelines developmentally for young women, and they don't know what to do. And they're increasingly not married, and they increasingly don't have children, and they're increasingly unhappy. And it doesn't look to me like slave to a corporation is necessarily a substitute for family life and children. Now, some people have a career, you have a career, some people have a career, most people have jobs. So, anyways, I'm not saying that that's a hard and fast rule, but I don't really see any way around it. And here's another little twist that is worth adding. I think most people who are popular and attractive get 5 chances to establish a permanent relationship, and that's about it.
That's fascinating.
Right.
That's
Well,
interesting. That may be true.
figure it's a year to kind of get to know someone.
Yeah.
And then assume that, you're fortunate enough so that people are lining up, which is not that likely and probably not the position that most people are in.
Right.
And so maybe it's too.
So just because this is on my mind, something as simple as what I just did adequately demonstrates the differences between men and women. And I'm sure, if my wife was backed into a corner and she had no choice, she would have handled this bug. But she was genuinely freaked out. She needed her husband to handle business. And I kicked that bug right in the face, man. I handled it. So
2 years including the failure, and 5 is a 10-year span, you know, I mean, I'm not trying to be overwhelmingly pessimistic, but I wouldn't say it gets easier as you get older. You get more different from other people. It isn't easier to establish a relationship when you're older, I wouldn't say.
And more
Plus,
Yeah, I would agree with that. You know, that's not something I didn't even think about, the number of opportunities you actually have to form a relationship. You know, it does go down the older you get, and the prospects of finding somebody too that is going to mesh with your life becomes more difficult, because when you're younger, you're essentially, you don't have a lot of really anything built or established. So if you meet somebody when you're young, you're building those things together. You're building family and legacy and your career together. Your home, you're building that together too. But the older you get, the more, one, set in your own ways you become. Two, you go longer building lives apart from one another. So let's say, you know, you are in your mid or early 30s and you meet somebody. Well, by now, most people have started to establish their careers, and you know, maybe they have, you know, a small house or something like that. Maybe they have a kid. Well, now the people that you meet, they likely might have a kid. You know, most maybe not most women, but you know, they have an entire life that they built apart from you, and now you have to merge those two things together, and that in itself creates complications that I don't think people think about.
people are snatched up.
well, there's that. That's a big problem, you know, who's left. And the other issue I would say too that's germane is, why wouldn't you want to spend your young years with the person that you want to be with? You know, you're going to forestall that for what reason? You know, I got married to Tammy when I was 27, I think, and one of our regrets is that we didn't do that earlier. Now, there were reasons for that, and maybe they were valid, probably they weren't, but I'm not happy that that time was missed. It would have been better to have spent it together. So I'd like your thoughts on that. I mean, the timeline, just that general layout.
I mean,
I think that's beautiful. I think that's romantic too. You know, yeah, I'm very grateful. I'm married, essentially my high school sweetheart, and we got to just, you know, spend as much time together as humanly possible, and we got to build a life together. And the thought or the prospect of having put that off and having less time with my spouse is something that I don't even want to think about, because I value that time that I've had with her, and that I have with her today. And I look back on the life that we've been able to live, and it's really cool. You know, you know, being in this house, you know, this is an answer to prayer. This is something that we worked toward together for a very long time. Having children is something we worked together to have. You know, this life that we built for ourselves is something that has been a long time coming, and it's beautiful that I have all these years, having been with my wife, to have built that. It's special. It's significant, and to think that people opt out of doing that for, at the end of the day, superficial things that really won't matter in the end.
and I think there's no problem in setting out those honest truths, which are your life will be happier if you have a partner and children. I just think that's just true. And people should be told that. And then they should be told the realities of fertility, because those are realities that, you know, can be potentially meddled with, but there's no guarantee. And if you're one of the people who cannot meddle with it and you missed your window, it will be a lifelong regret that will be unsolvable and will be like a deep source of pain, an ongoing deep source of pain. So it's not something that you could easily brush off. And so all those truths need to be shared, while at the same time prizing and sharing the fullness of the rewards of motherhood with young women, which isn't done. That's the other piece of it. Like if you listen to Jordan, if you listen to Ben, if you listen to, the Daily Wire, you'll hear that. You won't hear motherhood, early motherhood, or any kind of motherhood generally bashed. You'll hear it praised. But in society still, in the movies, on the television shows that women watch, it's not. You still hear she's just a stay-at-home mom, or she doesn't work. They still don't look at, motherhood as something that's, something valuable, like work as though it's a bad word. Motherhood is work too.
It sounds like Megyn Kelly has changed her tune a little bit, because this was not what she was saying before. She was basically talking about how, she chose the career path because she wants to be intellectually stimulated. And, in a previous, rant that she went on about Matt Walsh, so she chose that because she wanted to be intellectually stimulated. But here she seems to be softening the way that she talks about stay-at-home moms, probably because she realized it's offensive, as if stay-at-home moms can't be intellectually stimulated. So that's an interesting and, I would say, welcomed change in her mentality.
It's great work. It's life-fulfilling work, but it still has this and women who I know all over New York, and now I'm in Connecticut, they say things like, it's very important to me that my daughter see me going to a business meeting, like mommy's got a business meeting, or going to the office if they have just like some small meeting. And I'm like, why? Because they don't think the daughter will think that they're important if they don't have some sort of business pressing on them, which is absurd and hashtag part of the problem, right? Like, no, we all need to be teaching young girls and boys that motherhood is enough. Like, being a mother is a completely valid, beautiful, awesome, really important choice. I actually went to my daughter's school and I said, I think it's fine you have career night. It's an all-girls school. And you bring in doctors and lawyers and journalists and whomever. You need to bring in a stay-at-home mom. You need to have somebody stand up there and tell the girls, I made a totally different choice. And so much the better if she's got a great education. And she can say, yeah, I have all the same skills you have.
I think, yeah, I agree with her there. And it's something that harkens back to something I said earlier at the beginning of this. Is basically one of the questions that I opened with is, in high school, how many women heard anybody in their life talking positively about motherhood, suggesting that as a pathway in life? None. To the point where she's even suggesting, that it be to bring one in for career day, suggesting that it's not being done because it isn't being done. And I think that would be monumental. A mom coming in sharing how being a mother has changed her life for the better. You don't think that would have a positive effect on young women? I think it would be great. And thank God for TikTok and Shorts and Instagram and Daily Wire, because they are sending that message that kids need to hear.
And I was on the exact same path as you were. And I loved learning and being introduced to the classics and being able to sit around a dinner table with so-called intellectuals and know the references. And I chose a totally different path when I graduated from those schools, because there was one thing that was most important to me. And let me tell you how that's rewarded me. The school did not do it. Okay. So, we've got a counter program at home. So having said all that, I'll tell you my own personal experience, which doesn't really reflect that way of thinking or this recommended course at all. And yet still, I'm very, very happy. I'm a very contented person. Happy is a charged word, but I really am very happy with my life. I'm contented. I have a very, very strong marriage and extremely intact, loving, present, and meaningful relationships with my 3 kids. But I also have a very large career that's been hugely successful. Not to be self-aggrandizing, I'm just saying, like, on the scales of careers, mine has worked out very well. So in no way did I really sacrifice much in that lane. And I realize this puts me in the 0.00001% of people, and probably even fewer percent of women. So the way that I did it was not that unconventional for, when I grew up. I was definitely part of a generation that felt you work, you get to work. You graduate from college, go to college, but when you finish college, you work. That's the thing you do. But in my case, Jordan, from that day to this, I've always loved working. I love it. It's totally exciting and interesting and intellectually stimulating to me. And I cannot imagine not doing this. It's been really important to me. And if I looked at the 21 or 22-year-old version of me versus me now, or let's say when I had my kids, which was later, 38, 40, and 42, I guarantee you, I personally, this isn't true of everybody, but I personally would not have been anywhere near as good a mother. I was much more selfish and less capable of giving. And, I was more of a taker, like most young people are. Not all, but most. And so I really think that the calm I've brought to motherhood, the life lessons, the wisdom, has been a boon to my children who are calm and cool and not panickers and have a wisdom about.
Something that she hasn't at least mentioned this far is that what if by having kids earlier, she would have learned to actually be a less selfish person? Maybe, in fact, she would be less selfish now than she currently is, because she would understand in an early age what it takes to raise kids. And it does take a degree of selflessness that confronts you with your own selfishness. Having kids has made me a less selfish person the older I get. And I started learning those lessons when I had my first daughter. Because you have to learn those lessons if you want to be a good parent.
About them that I think you kind of get through osmosis and maybe some genetics, but they're in a very good place, I think, in part thanks to the fact that it's not age related for everybody, but for me, I didn't reach that place in my life until I was older. And unfortunately, it wasn't planned this way, because I didn't meet my husband until we were 35. But unfortunately, and believe me, I think about it all the time, it means that my children and I have a shorter runway together. And I hate that fact. It haunts me. I'm so grateful that I have them at all, unlike so many women who weren't this fortunate. But I hate the fact that every time we talk about their lives, I'm calculating, it's his age plus 42. That's what I'll be, when my youngest has his children. And boy, my kids better have kids young if they want me to be part of that child's life at all. If I get to be a grandparent. And
so her kids have to basically ignore how she lived her life. They basically have to ignore the example that she set so that she will have the privilege of being a grandparent. Or she wouldn't have that problem if she had had kids when she was younger.
It's its own special form of pain, Like, would I have traded my career building and doing the things that I love? Because I was a lawyer for the first 10 years, and then I switched to journalism. I don't know if I can say that. I didn't meet the right man until I was 35. If Doug had come into my life at 22 and I rejected him, and then we went and married different people and refound each other at 35, that would be really painful. But I don't have that regret. We didn't meet until the time I think God brought us together. And for me, that was the time. That's when I was ready. I was ready to not downshift in my career exactly, but to make compromises in my career that I hadn't been prior to that. And I was fully committed to devoting myself to motherhood in a way I never had been before. And some of it was born of the intense love that I had for my husband and still have, in which my kids were born into, this swath of like truly mad romantic love that they're products of and are immersed in every day, which is probably the best medicine for them. So I have no regrets about how I did it, but I also acknowledge it's not all roses and unicorns. There are downsides to doing it the way I did.
I don't know. It does sound to me like she has a little bit of regret. Her words, it haunts her that she has a shorter runway. That sounds like a regret to me. If something's haunting me, that means there's a degree of regret and pain associated with that. So it sounds to me like she does have some regrets.
Shopify powers millions of businesses worldwide. Craft compelling Shopify. Sign up for your
especially we team
today.
youth obsessed, and I suppose that came out of consumer culture in the 1960s when, for the first time in human history, young people had excess money to spend and could be, marketed at. We tend to construe, especially in popular culture, life as if you're old by the time you're 30.
Right.
And
oh, Jordan, when I broke into journalism, I was 32, and I thought, I'll never be accepted in this business. I'm too old. I will have no future in this industry. It was like
right.
so silly.
That turned out to be wrong. Yeah. Well, but that's why it's so useful to start a discussion, let's say, about the actual span of life. I mean, you said that one of your potential regrets, is that you've truncated the time that you'll have as a grandmother, let's say.
Yeah.
And you took advantage of that when you were young, and there was some utility in that for you, but that is a price that is lurking, and it's very difficult to tell how it will play out. But as a pattern, it's something for people to give some consideration to. Optimally, you want to be a grandparent when you're still youthful enough to be active and engaged, and then you get to have the pleasures of having children again.
And that's something I really look forward to, is being a grandparent one day. And I want to have the energy and the stamina to be an awesome grandparent. I want to be that awesome grandpa that plays and takes the kids out on camping trips and shares with them my wisdom, and I want that. And that's not something I don't, and I also want the health to go along with it, which is why I prioritize being healthy right now, because I want to be healthy later for not just my kids and my wife, but my future grandchildren. So that's why I invest in my body right now, because I want to be of good health later on. And yeah, I think that's something that's important that really not many people think of.
And that's a pretty good deal. And it is something, like, we're not good at conceptualizing the entire span of life consciously. That's what roles were for. So you didn't actually have to think about that. But we have to think about it now. There's another perversity in this that I really have a hard time figuring out, because I would say that by and large, the feminist movement that's at the bottom of some of the things we're talking about has been a left-wing movement. And I do not understand for the life of me how in the world it can be logically coherent that the left can be anti-capitalist, anti-corporate, and pro-career. Like, I just can't. Yeah, so there's that. So we could talk about that it's like, okay, corporations are evil, and there isn't any higher purpose you can serve as a woman than to serve one. It's like, okay, I'm not exactly.
Yeah, that is quite the contradiction, isn't it? They rail over the plights of capitalism while also encouraging women to go work in this capitalistic system. It does seem like quite the contradiction. I do want to back up real quick and address something that Megyn said. So she said she loved working and she can't imagine not doing it. She loved it, and loves it. And that is one of those things that I think shows like a lack of maturity, I guess, to a degree, because there are things that I love doing that I cannot do anymore because I'm a father. And that's not a bad thing. All right. This is one of the trade-offs of being a parent, is that you give up some things that you loved doing for the sake of your children. All right. One of my dreams, one of the things I wanted to do is ride a motorcycle. But when I had kids, I thought, not worth the risk. All right, not worth it to me. You know, one of the things I love doing is going on mission trips. I love it. But I'm not doing it nearly as much as I would like to, that's for sure. But that's a sacrifice that I'm willing to make. I'm willing to give up that which I love for something that I love even more, which is my children. You know, and that's the priority that I think we need to have, is that we give up things that we love for the sake of our families. Like right now, I'm working in cybersecurity. Let me tell you this, I don't love it, okay? It's not my favorite, okay? It's not my wheelhouse. But I'm doing it for the sake of my family, because of a deep love and duty that I have toward my wife and kids, and to be a provider. And the things that I love doing, which is this, I do on the side. And it's enough. I have it all. Because my priorities too are in order. And I think that's the right mentality to have.
Be sure what to make of that.
Now what?
Then I want to tell you a weird little story too. I was looking at the Brothers Grimm Snow White version recently, because I went and saw the Disney Snow White version, which, you know, was exactly the sort of mistake that you'd think it would be, both to attend and to produce. And so I want to just tell you a snippet of that story. So Snow White is young and beautiful, and the evil queen wants that, right? So she's an older woman who is competing with the younger woman for the younger woman's advantages. That's the evil queen. Okay, now Snow White has to run away from the evil queen. Right, and where does she go? Well, she goes out into the forest, which is the unknown, but she goes to where the dwarfs are. Now, in the Grimm's brother fairy tale, the dwarfs don't have names, so they're kind of generic. But they keep an orderly house, and they work very hard. So the Grimm brothers dwarfs, now we don't know how old these fairy tales are, by the way. There have been some folklorists who've traced some fairy tales back like 10,000 years. They're very old. Okay, so it's wisdom speaking, you could say. So Snow White goes to what? To serve the dwarves. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that to escape the evil queen, she has to make a pact with ordinary masculinity, right? She has to serve the dwarfs. Now, why? Because they protect her from the evil queen. Now, among primates, there is a phenomenon called fertility suppression, which is where women compete, the females compete to suppress the fertility of other females. And it's a very widespread phenomenon that's well known among primatologists and biologists, and it definitely characterizes human beings. And so the evil queen in the Snow White story is suppressing the fertility of Snow White. Now, she runs away from that and takes shelter among the ordinary men, the dwarves, let's say, who are the positive side of the patriarchy, you might say it that way. When the evil queen comes back, she shows up again, right? And she offers Snow White 3 gifts. The first is a bodice that's too tight and just about strangles her. So that's exaggeration of it's a narcissistic exaggeration of sexuality as a temptation. The second is a poisoned comb, right? Same thing in slightly different guise, right? Right, she's tempting Snow White to be poisoned by the worship of her own beauty. That's a good way of thinking about it. That's what the evil queen does. The third gift is the poisoned apple. Now, of course, that harkens back to the Genesis story. Anything you incorporate is something that changes you. It's like you incorporate knowledge. And so it's poisoned knowledge. And the dwarfs can't save her from that. And that's the situation young women are in the modern world, because the evil queen feeds them poisoned knowledge. And the
Dang, that was deep. that was deep. Yeah. See, this is why JP is the GOAT, man. I don't care what people say about Jordan Peterson. I love this man. This man is brilliant, and that's a really astute observation that he made.
The deep question is why? And the real skeptic would say, well, the older, jealous, childless women are doing absolutely everything they can to destroy the fertility of young women. Now,
yeah, that's crazy. That's something I didn't really think about. Yeah, they're sabotaging the new generation. They're trying to rob them of something that they themselves will never experience because they sacrificed children on the altar of their career. So they're encouraging other women to do the same thing because, as they say, misery enjoys company.
there's a corollary to that, which is this happened to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for example. It's often the women in these brutally patriarchal societies who enforce the worst impositions on young women. Like female genital mutilation, for example, is often a practice conducted by grandmothers.
Ayaan knows about that.
Yeah, that's for sure. And so there's a brutality in this, a brutality in the, and I think you see it taken to its logical conclusion, by the way, with this trans phenomena. Because I told the bloody Senate in Canada in 2016 when they crammed through that idiot pronoun bill that was a compelled speech bill, I told them that they would produce a psychogenic epidemic among young women. Because what happens when you confuse people about something basic like their sex, you confuse the most confused the most. And so, for example, a 1% increase in unemployment produces a 5% increase in psychiatric hospitalizations.
Wow.
Because you put a little pressure on the people who are barely hanging in there and they're done. Well, if you take, the swath of girls or boys, but girls are more prone to psychogenic epidemics, you take the swath of them that are confused for 15 reasons and you add 6 more reasons. And
yeah, you push these women over the edge and you cause a crisis. And that's why you see a lot of these women that are unhappy and miserable, and it's because that these cycles with the pronoun stuff added to exasperated something that was already there and set them over the edge.
They're done. And so, and we can see the full horror show that's the surgical mutilation and sterilization as the ultimate exemplar of this evil queen phenomenon. It's really dark.
Let me ask you a question about it.
Yeah.
Do you think in this scenario that the evil queens are conscious of what they're doing? Or it's just...
That's a great question.
It's their own self-loathing.
Before he answers, I don't think all of them are. I think some of them are for sure. I think some of them are conscious of what they're doing. But I think for the most part, they built this machine that they don't even fully understand how to shut off. They don't know how to get out of it themselves, because the feminism is so internalized that most people, at least I would say on the conservative side, they don't even recognize that they're victims of it.
Working itself out.
Here's a way of thinking about it. Every time you make a decision, you're conscious of it. But you make a lot of micro decisions and you don't remember them, right? Like you don't remember all the decisions you made yesterday, or certainly not a week ago. But that doesn't mean you weren't conscious when you made the decision. Okay, now if you make 1,000 little decisions in the wrong direction, you were conscious at each of those decision points. You might not be cognizant of where you've ended up. And, that's the tale of many a society's disintegration into blind totalitarianism. Look, when people fail to speak up in a state that's tilting towards totalitarianism, every time they know they should say something and they don't, they're conscious. Now, they might not be conscious of where they're going to get to if they keep that up, because that's the road to hell for sure. But they're conscious every step of the way, and so they're culpable. Now,
I read this book by, I think the guy's name is Rob Dreher, and it's called Live Not by Lies. And he basically suggests that when a totalitarian regime is trying to take over, that you don't be complicit in the lies, that you are intentional about your actions, and that you don't hold up the lies. And that means, though, that you have to make a conscious effort not to lie, not to participate in it. And I think that that's kind of connected to what he's saying right now. Just interesting.
If you're talking to someone who's made a lot of bad decisions in therapy, for example, and trying to help them identify where they took, where they met the devil at the crossroads and made the wrong choice, you're going to have to do a lot of reviewing. And to some degree, that's the representation of all that to consciousness, because it's become implicit. It's become part of the way that you look at the world. But it's conscious when you do it or don't do it.
Well, I mean, I would like to think that this is what I've been thinking while you've been talking, with all due respect, because I have a lot of friends who are Democrat women. But I feel like you're talking about liberal women and not just women, because the conservative women I know are just not like that. They just have a totally different set of values, and they live by them, and they raise children by them. And I think we see the results of it. I don't know why, and not even necessarily your average Democrat woman, but a lot of them, but certainly leftist women. Yeah, I mean, I just feel like everything you said applies, and it's obvious.
Well, here's another weird data point. So psychologists have known for a long while, that sociologists as well, that people become more conservative as they get older. So that's how the data is explained. As people age, they become more conservative. But you can take exactly that same data and you can put another twist on it. It's exactly as explanatory, and I think it's more accurate. The reason this hasn't happened is because academics, including the researchers, are radically biased in the direction of the liberals. It isn't that you become more conservative as you get older. It's that conservatism is the political expression of maturity, and liberalism, progressivism, and the hedonism that goes along with it, that self-centered hedonism that is part and parcel, let's say, of the Pride movement, that is the political expression of immaturity. And so here's something else this explains, because this is a perverse fact. There has been no economic and conceptual doctrine that's been more radically discredited than, let's say, the radical leftism, the Marxist brands of leftism. But it doesn't go away. So it's not leftism, it's not Marxism. It's Marxism is the most radical expression of hedonistic immaturity. And the reason it doesn't go away is because hedonistic immaturity.
And Christianity is the most radical expression of maturity. Just throwing that out there.
Maturity doesn't go away. It battles with maturity. And as you become more mature, you become more conservative, because conservatives are community-oriented and not self-oriented. Now, interestingly as well, on the psychological side, there is no distinction between thinking about yourself and being unhappy. Those things are so tightly aligned that you can't dissociate them statistically. Right. So as you become more conservative, but truly more mature, the way you orient your life is toward the future and towards other people. And that turns out not exactly to make you happy, and you pointed this out. You said happiness was a fraught word, and I agree, because happiness is a hedonistic goal. But secure in your identity, free from chaotic anxiety, goal-directed, purpose-driven, and in service to others, right? Well,
yeah, those are basic tenets of Christianity, is that you will the good of other people and that you serve other people, and that is a sign of maturity. And I think, conservatism offers that, where liberalism offers the exact opposite. And all the motives of liberal ideology are focused entirely on the self, which will blind people to seeing their neighbor starving around them, or will give them the deluded idea that they need to rob their neighbor to help people in need. But the truth is that they wouldn't even do that. I had presented on my threads I made a statement basically saying that poor people don't hate the rich because the rich are greedy. They hate the rich because they're not rich. And I stand by that. I believe that to be true, because what they really want is their wealth. And the problem isn't being rich. The problem is a lack of generosity. But you don't need to be rich to be generous. Generosity is something that you could do being very poor, because that's something that comes from the heart. You know, there's that famous passage in the Bible about all these, Pharisees are in the temple giving their tithes and giving their offerings. And this one woman comes up and she puts, a denarii in the offering bucket. And Jesus, says she's given more than everybody because she gave everything that she had. And that's the mentality that we need to have. And that's a sign of maturity, is being generous. And living for other people is a sign of maturity, which is something too, by the way, becoming a parent fosters in an individual, because you no longer are living for yourself. You're living for other people. You're living for your family, your wife, your kids. And being a part of a church also demands that of you.
Well, that's not bad. That's a good substitute for happiness. In fact, if you were wise and mature, that's what you would substitute for happiness, right? That's why Pinocchio discovers nothing but slavery on Pleasure Island, by the way. So, right, because, if you're a slave to your hedonic whims, that doesn't make you happy. It just makes you a slave.
I also don't think happiness alone is the most important virtue to pursue. I think service to others by default does make you happy, does bring you joy. So like me, I'm not primarily interested in pursuing my own happiness. I am primarily interested in serving the needs of God and my family. And the natural byproduct of that is joy, which is something too that's more lasting than happiness. Happiness is fleeting, it ebbs and flows. Joy is something that is consistent. I wake up every day and I have joy. I go to bed at night and I have joy. It's just something that is mine, because my primary focus is not my own will, but God's will for my life.
Right. So, okay, so...
But let me ask you, because
yeah.
I look at the political divide you mentioned when we kicked this off between young people, young men and young women. And it doesn't surprise me one iota that young women are liberal. But it does surprise me that young men are now becoming conservative in greater numbers than I've ever seen in my lifetime.
Yeah.
I mean, it does and it doesn't. It doesn't, because I follow politics for a living and I've seen what the left has done to young men. So I see it's a natural gravitation. But what do you think that that's what's caused it? And if so, why aren't young women open to that? We've seen some young women start to vote Trump with the Trump hats. I tend to believe, maybe I'm totally wrong, this is completely anecdotal, but I tend to believe they see these young men who are very pro-Trump with the hat, and it's kind of cool, and they like the guys wearing those hats, and they like what those guys are saying and the way they're acting, and it's a natural aphrodisiac. And so next thing you know, those women have the hat on and they're open-minded and they're hearing it discussed.
Okay. Let's delve into that a little bit. First of all, I think it's happening to young men. I think that the podcast crowd has had a fair bit to do with that. And I think the reason for that is that that's the only place that young men find encouragement. And that encouragement, I've been struck to the core in my travels and my encounters with thousands of people, or tens of thousands of people, many of them young men, how little encouragement is enough. None is not enough. Some is enough. And
it's really sad when you think about it, that the only place that men find encouragement is, in podcasts. It shouldn't be that way. That shouldn't be the only place men are getting validation.
some encouragement from the podcast sphere world, and that's enough. Now, why not young women? Well, Megyn, one of the mistakes that pollsters make is assuming that 16-year-old boys or 18-year-old boys, let's say, and 18-year-old girls inhabit the same world. They don't, because worldwide, women prefer men who are about 4 years older. And I would say that proclivity is even more pronounced in early, in the teen years and in the early 20s. So I think we should be matching young men against girls who are 4 years younger, not the same age. So we'll see how that plays out, in the upcoming years. So that would be the first thing. It is also not obvious to me that the conservative types have done a particularly good job of communicating with young women. Now, there's a bunch of reasons for that, like the 18 to 34-year-old female crowd gravitates not towards YouTube and the longer form content that at least at once was the hallmark of YouTube, but to these more pathological social worlds. Tumblr was one of them, wherever you get a large aggregation of young women who are unsupervised, let's say, or unmentored. That's a better way of thinking about it. Look the hell out, because that's a breeding ground for social pathology. And young women get a lot of their information, I think it's 60 to 70% from TikTok.
I know, it's terrifying.
And TikTok is a complete bloody snake pit, and the Chinese and the Iranians and the Russians have a major hand in that. And so that's not good.
Some of the most unhinged comments that I've ever seen and got have been from TikTok. That's the only platform that I have to self-censor on, or I couldn't exist on that platform. And because of that, these women will never actually be exposed to counter arguments, or if they do, they are experiencing or are being met with the watered down version of arguments against feminism.
And the main reasons I'm on TikTok, as a show, as a content creator, because I want my voice out there and I want people to hear me and my message, just especially young women, to hear there's another way and there are different ways of thinking about this. But I think about the Trump election, Jordan. I sat in this very studio that night with a bunch of young men from my son's high school, and there were 16, 17 of them. And we were up late, Trump, the election wasn't called until I think the 2 a.m. hour. And these guys, they didn't have to be a conservative or a Trump supporter to come here. Probably naturally, a lot of them just were. But when we called it for Trump, and I'm sure you saw this in your own world, but they weren't just like, yes, they were like this. Thank God. They were, they were head in hands, like running their hands through their hair, like near tears it was more than joy. It was like relief.
Yeah. Well, could you imagine a 4-year term of Kamala Harris?
No, but when I was
the LGBTQ crowd,
17,
oh my God.
These guys were that into it because they knew, they had seen what happened, I think, to the class ahead of them and the one ahead of that and their older brothers and maybe their fathers, and that's why, to me, it's so crazy. You've got in our society now, Democrats throwing $20 million, it was in the New York Times this week, at trying to figure out the syntax to use.
These people too, the Democrats, are just retarded. They're so stupid. All right, they're the way that they're trying to appeal to young men is by having this fat lesbian Spanish woman appeal to them. And ironically, she cites that all the problems, that young men agree with most liberal ideology. And they just couldn't have picked a worse person to speak to men than this individual. And yet it shows me that they know nothing about men, because their liberal ideology, feminist ideology, won't allow them to understand how to actually communicate with men, how to speak our language, how to appeal to us, which I'm grateful for, because men like Peterson, Walsh, myself, we can speak to young men because we actually understand the reasons young men are frustrated and the reasons why men like Trump are so appealing to them. And we could speak to them, and we understand that they have been neglected, ignored, derided, and we can actually give them a message of hope where the Democrats can't even bring themselves to say a single nice word about them. That their messaging continues to be that everything about men is fundamentally toxic.
To connect with young men, I'm like, you talk about being myopic. You don't have the first idea where you've gone wrong or how profound the loss is. You actually think you're going to be able to reach those boys with their heads in their hands in that sort of profound relief that Trump won by changing your syntax? Or we've seen some of these Democrat senators throw out a swear word here or there. They have no idea the depths of the betrayal, I think, that these young men are feeling from those political leaders. And to me, that's the biggest divide right now, what the left has done to these young men. Not as much what just women. Yes, women, but also men of the left who have abandoned them or at least gone along with these dominant women at the BLM protests and in corporate America preaching these things because they can't find their balls to stand up for what they know is right and exercise, yes, maybe some toxic masculinity. Here and there, it's actually quite useful.
I don't think it is toxic masculinity. I think it's healthy masculinity. Healthy masculinity stands up to evil and stands up for what's right. They don't shrink back and cower and acquiesce to feminist garbage. They don't go along with it.
Well, as I said, my experience has been that the best pathway out for those young men is encouragement. Say, you're not who you could be. You could get your act together. There could be a lot more to you if you were willing to develop it. And, don't accept the line that you're intrinsically pathological. I had a friend who committed suicide because of that fundamentally when he was about 40. He had bought the sort of nihilistic Buddhist line that, the patriarchy was evil and male ambition was part of the force that was destroying the world. And he was a guilty colonialist. He lived up in northern Alberta where there was a lot of Native Canadians and there was a fair bit of tension there. And he wouldn't even defend himself in a physical fight if it came to that because he was so guilty. And, and some of that was irresponsibility on his part, let's say, and unwillingness to grow up and take on the challenges of productive life. I'm not trying to lay it all at the feet of the social world, but I saw that in him, and it did him in by the time he was 40, and he was a very smart, attractive, talented person. He had his problems for sure, but that betrayal that you describe, it's strikes right to the core. Mm-hmm. There's nothing moral about demoralizing young people, young men, in the name of defending Mother Nature against the patriarchy. It's an ancient form of nature worship violation. It always ends in child sacrifice, which is exactly the situation today. It's pathological to the core.
And when young men in general are in a place of despair, that's a recipe for all kinds of disaster. That's a recipe for creating the absolute worst kinds of men. Men that renege on responsibility, men that aren't willing to stand up for what is right, men that use their appetite for sex to engage in all forms of depravity. It creates the absolute worst type of men, which is what we have been dealing with for the past 4 years or 10 years with this liberal ideology that has taken captive the minds of many men, unfortunately, and women.
And as you said, the Democrats, all they can do is ape respect for masculinity. I mean, they tried to trot out Tim Walz as a man. You know, I mean, really, I mean, you know, there are worse examples of men than Tim Walz, admittedly, but we might also point out
No one's coming to mind, but I'm sure theoretically, spend enough time
if you're
on
looking
it.
for if you're looking for archetype of admirable masculinity, I wouldn't start with him.
No.
I mean, right. Well, and the fact that that was even an
He's the
idea,
shell of a
I'm
man.
not trying to denigrate Walz specifically, but the idea that
can
was.
I just say on the same front, yes, as horrible as they come. I mean, tampon in the boys' rooms, that's enough. Tampon Tim is enough to convince me he's not the archetype. But
They put those in the military bathrooms in Canada, you know.
You know, we
just
had,
so you know.
They've been in some, you know, bathrooms at Facebook. That was one of the things that Mark Zuckerberg undid as he became more right wing or more of a Trump supporter. But I think more about somebody like Doug Emhoff. To me, he's even more of like the poster boy for this problem because he's married to Kamala Harris. He is utterly feckless. If you see him speak publicly or in interviews, all he's trying to do is project sweater man. You know, I would never wear a suit because I'm a sweater man. I'm approachable. I'm a feminist. I'm a likable. I'm non-threatening. And he buys into all the tropes. You know, I'm married to a professional, successful woman. I'm happy to be the second gentleman, not threatened by it at all. Only in his case, as it is in so many of these people who bend over backward to live up to that image, it's all fake. He's actually not a supportive partner at all. He's not comfortable in his own skin. And I mean, I don't like the word feminist and I don't call myself feminist, but I think you could create a definition of that word that would be flattering. You know, it could be used in modern day America in a way that could really embody what could be great about femininity. Anyway, my point is he's not it. And he is behind the scenes, according to the Daily Mail and the woman to whom it happened, an abuser, a physical abuser of women. So it's always those guys, right?
This is really funny too, because a certain individual that I debated that was a feminist turned out ironically to be somebody that like showed his genitals to women without their consent. And I just found it rich. It was like the chef's kiss, like, oh, you little worm. You little pathetic worm. You know, take this, you know, like you're for feminism and you're against the patriarchy. And here you are exhibiting some of the most degenerate behaviors toward women. It was very ironic.
Ones who are totally against the patriarchy and the first to speak out against toxic masculinity and throw their fellow men under the bus as a sex, as problematic, who, you know, are in the sweater and saying they'll be second gentlemen. And then you find out they're actually beating the women in their life. That's the allegation. I've spoken to his accuser directly. There's plenty of corroborating evidence. And not one journalist would even ask him about it, Jordan, when they got this guy in front of them. Now, all these self-serving leftists who say that kind of a man would be terrible. We wouldn't want that man anywhere near 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Never mind a role model for our little boys and girls. Not only did they not inquire into the story, when they had him across from them, wouldn't even ask about it. And to me, that is the embodiment of the problem on the left. They elevate guys like that who actually are complete shits. And they want us to celebrate them as non-toxically masculine. Whereas they're looking at an actual man who will throw a punch in defense of a woman or just a weakling who might be getting bullied in a public setting and say he's the problem. His natural male instincts to protect or compete or get ahead are somehow problematic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's the same ethos that underlies the insistence in so many schools, for example, that there can only be cooperative games. Right? There's no winners and losers because we're all winners, and there can only be. And it's so pathological, Megyn, because first of all, competitive games are cooperative because everybody plays by the rules. So they're founded on cooperation, right? They have the rules of the game are the constitution of the playing field, and everyone accepts that. And then if you're a fair player, you abide by the rules in practice and spirit, and that's cooperation. And so what it actually is civilized combat within a container of cooperation. So it's unbelievably sophisticated. And then the victory and the loss issue is, well, how about you learn to be a good winner? And how about you learn to have some resilience in the face of loss and take some responsibility for it? And all that does is strengthen you in every possible way. And our education systems, K through 12, are so pathological and so miseducated that they don't even understand those basics about games, right? And games are they're a microcosm of society, and we get all that wrong. And so that ambitious striving forward towards victory, you might say, that's the hallmark of stereotypical masculinity, has become demonized, even though it's a hallmark of the civilized conduct that's also protective and resilient.
Well, let me ask.
I think that is an important thing too. Is we need to bring back competition in the schools and allow more room for students to participate in team sports and engage in healthy competition, and also to handle loss well. One of the proudest moments that I've experienced this past year was last year. My daughter had won this award called the Gravitas Award. Basically, she was the most exemplary kid in her class, and I was very proud of her. It's not to say that it caught me by surprise, because I know how great she is, but sometimes other people don't see what you see. But she ended up winning, and it was awesome. And this year we were wondering if she was going to get it again, and she didn't. Her really close friend got it. And I looked back to kind of just see her reaction, see how she was handling the news that she didn't win. And I look back, and she has this beaming smile on her face, and she's clapping and celebrating that her friend won this award. And I just thought, that's the right mindset. They could be competitive, but when the other person wins, they celebrate in that victory. They learn to lose well and learn from that experience.
What if we did an experiment starting, the 2025-26 school year, where we radically changed the so-called academy and we made it much more heavily male, the way it used to be? And I don't know what we would do with those women who were formerly in those leadership. They're now running these universities, but let's just say they don't all have to go, but let's say we reduce the numbers dramatically. Forget where the women go and what we do with them. It's a different problem for a different day. But do you think that the men who would be running those universities would actually change them? Would today's collection of men want to be the men too?
That's a good question, Megyn. Men, what's the old joke? You know what happened never? 20 women got together and built a boat and traveled to a distant land. Right. I mean, well, we don't true. Actually. Right. Well, we don't actually know, I would say, a tremendous amount about those closed sex dynamics. Men are pretty good at sorting themselves out on the basis of competence when they're thrown together in a group. And I think the reason for that, think about it this way, evolutionarily, well, why would you ally yourself with the best hunter? Because maybe the best hunter is the highest status guy. It's like, well, you don't die, that's a start, and you get to eat, and so does your family, and logical. Maybe proximity to the top dog confers status, not the highest status, but, do you want to be the quarterback on the winning football team? Yes, but being even the water boy is better than not playing at all. And men are pretty good at that. If they're thrown together in a group and there's a task, they sort themselves out pretty quickly in relationship to competence at the task. Now, that can get perverted by power and tyranny and, aggression. But all things considered, that's the way men conduct themselves.
Okay, let me ask you something. Let me ask you something. Just to follow up on that, forgive me. My worry about that scenario, this is completely offbeat, but I genuinely have this worry, is like all the toxins in the environment, all the microplastics, all the messing with hormones that's happening through our drinking water. these guys, through no fault of their own, may be getting more and more feminine. And it's
also the case, Megyn, that women on the birth control pill are less attracted to masculine men.
Well, it's definitely hormonal manipulation. There's no question.
Oh yeah, and we have absolutely no idea whatsoever the political consequences of the birth control pill. We have no idea. It could be catastrophic for all we know, because we don't know what it means that women find masculine men less attractive on the pill than off. Like, we don't know what the political ramifications of that are. They don't have to be that great to be determining, given the small margins of victory that constitute the typical political campaign. So these sorts of questions that you're raising, like they're open-ended. We don't know, and the same thing applies with regards to hormonal alteration in the environment.
I think we're finally going to look into it, though. This is one of the reasons why I was such a big supporter of RFKJ. Is I really think you have someone in there who is very open-minded to looking into those kinds of things. I mean, the microplastics, geez, I don't even know how we're going to solve that. But there is evidence that it's hormonally manipulating us in a very unfortunate way. And that, if that's true, I mean, the latest data says that we have the equivalent of 5 bottle caps worth of plastic in our brains. We'll never be able to solve that. We need medical doctors to actually help. And further depressing us is the fact that even if you eliminate all plastics from your life, you never put plastic in the microwave so it doesn't seep into your food, you're inhaling plastics that they're using in Germany. That's what the data are. So to me, I just feel like there's so many things we have to solve for. Even if we were to take out our pen and write the guidelines down and then everybody were to live by them, we've lost something as a society when it comes to basic, like, health, wellness, caretaking, a structure in the world order that would allow for all those things to blossom. And up until about 2 minutes ago, we were paying zero attention to that as a factor.
Yeah, well, I guess that's what we hope will transpire as a consequence of this tilt spearheaded by the U.S. towards productive conservatism. Hopefully we'll see that spread, well, not to Canada by all appearances, but perhaps,
our evil top
and not
hat,
to
as
Australia.
Michael Knowles calls it.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, we should bring this to a close. I know that your time is constrained today. We're going to go over to the Daily Wire side. I think what we'll do there is I think we'll continue a discussion on motherhood per se, because I'm curious about how you managed that, and also about the manner in which having children shifted the way you looked at the world, and also in what you would tell young women about that shift in perspective that's attendant on having your own child, which is a very different thing than looking at someone else's child. So I think we'll delve into that. Yeah, and I did a lot of management consulting with women as part of my clinical practice, and watched a number of them have children at, in their 30s and later, and watched what the transformation was like, and also the pain that women had when that didn't work. That's not fun. That's not fun. So we'll delve into that on the Daily Wire side. Thank you very much for talking to me today. Much appreciated.
Pleasure's mine.
Appreciate your insights on this thorniest of all problems, and maybe we'll make some headway with it. It's certainly the case that your work on TikTok is extremely useful, because young women are dying for guidance in the same way that young men were 10 years ago.
I know.
They need some women who aren't evil queens to guide them,
That's right. Well, I mean, bit by bit, right? Brick by brick, as they say.
Yeah, right. Exactly. A typical conservative attitude. Good to talk to you, Megyn.
You too, Jordan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank.
All right. So Megyn was a little bit more agreeable than I expected her to be honest with you guys. It was a very different side of Megyn than what I've seen in some of the clips that have made the rounds. And she seemed much more agreeable in that conversation. Now, one thing that I wish she would have done, it would have spoken to a little bit more, is what can women do to start turning the tides? The conversation did go, it seemed to kind of go back to, the problems and plights that men are facing, and not, though, a lot of time spent on what women can actually do to change about themselves. So I would like to see her speaking to women, focusing on being people of character, focusing on being virtuous women, women that prioritize the affairs of their own family first and foremost. And I just felt like she could have touched on that a little bit more. Being chaste, that's something that is really important. But I don't hear very many women, at least conservative women, uh, I guess, like Megyn Kelly talking about it. So overall, though, I thought it was a pretty good conversation, very insightful. Jordan Peterson is a world-class guy. Really appreciate his work, and I think he's done monumental work to help men overcome adversity. So I appreciate him, and I appreciate you guys for tuning in. This live stream was probably one of the most active ones I've had in quite a long time. So I appreciate you. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, comments, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. And as always, like, share, subscribe, and click that notification bell to stay notified every time we go live. And we go live every Monday through Saturday at 9 p.m. I hope you guys have a blessed night. Deuces.